This story takes place back in 2010. At the time, I was a 25-year-old guy that had a 2-bedroom apartment. It was pretty nice and more on the expensive side. I did originally have a roommate when I moved in, but he moved out and left me needing a new roommate. My old roommate is still a friend, and he left on good terms. I passed the word throughout my group of friends, hoping to find someone that needed a place to stay. After a couple weeks had gone by and I wasn't able to find anyone, I began to grow a little nervous about how I would pay all of my bills. This led me to resorting to posting an ad on Craigslist in search of a roommate. I wasn't looking for any exact type of person in particular, just someone respectful that would always pay their rent. I got a decent amount of replies, and 3 different people ended up taking a look at the place. The first 2 both seemed fine and told me they were interested, but that they would let me know when they decide. And then I met Paul. Paul came off as a decent, timid guy. He was only a couple years older than me, and really nothing stood out about him. But he said he wanted to move immediately, and he had the money ready too, so that was good enough for me. I notified the other 2 individuals that the room had been rented out, gave Paul a key, and he moved his stuff in the following day. Everything was fine at first. Paul continued to be timid and quiet, and we really didn't interact much. But this didn't bother me. I was more worried about having a slob or a loud roommate. Paul would quietly stay in his room almost always. He would sometimes come out to either use the restroom or heat up a pack of noodles, but that was about it. I never saw him leave for work or anything, but after the first month went by, he paid me rent and all was well. I respected the way Paul was, and when we crossed paths, I would just smile and nod, always being able to tell he wasn't really trying to interact with me at all. Paul and I lived together peacefully for the next few months. He always paid his rent on time and just continued spending almost all of his time in his bedroom. I was definitely curious about him. I really wanted to know what he was always doing in there and how he was able to come up with rent money, things of that nature. But due to his personality, or lack thereof, I never pried at him and asked him the questions I wanted answers to. In a way, Paul was the perfect roommate. I essentially had the entire apartment to myself, but still had someone helping me pay the bills. Time went on, and Paul continued the same behavior as normal. I became used to it, and although it was odd to me, I eventually stopped even really thinking about it. Despite not really having any interaction with Paul, I was always at least able to tell when he was home. He was pretty quiet, but I would still regularly hear or see him on his way to or from the kitchen or bathroom. But one day, I eventually noticed that I hadn't heard or seen any sign of him. At that point, I began paying particular attention, trying to determine whether or not he was home. I honestly didn't feel comfortable even knocking on his door to see how he was. It felt like it would be some invasion of his privacy, even doing that much. But after a few days of seeing no sign of him, I began worrying he was lying dead in his room or something. So I finally went and knocked on his door. There was no answer. I knocked harder and still got no reply. I tried entering his room, but it was locked. The next day, I decided I was going into his room one way or another. It was just a simple handle lock and was pretty easy to bypass with the right tool. Upon entering his room, I was met with a feeling of relief. Paul wasn't lying dead in his room after all, but this still led me to question where he was at or what happened to him. I ended up deciding I was just overreacting to this whole situation and thought he probably went out of town and didn't tell me because he doesn't tell me anything. About 2 more weeks passed and I still had not heard any sign from him. I did email him a couple times at the email address we'd originally talked through when he first came to look at the apartment. I never got his phone number from him because there was never a time I needed it for anything. It was at this time that the first of the month came and passed. Another week passed and there was no money from Paul or any sign of him at all. That's when I decided that I needed to find a new roommate. I was going to pack up Paul's belongings and store them in the garage until he showed up to pick them up. I reposted my ad on Craigslist and started packing Paul's stuff. His room looked like someone was completely living out of it, which I guess is because that's exactly what had been going on. It wasn't disgusting or anything, but it was extremely cluttered and looked like someone had been staying in it for years rather than months. He had 2 computers, a TV, a bed, desk, etc., a bunch of normal things. But I found some other things that weren't so normal. In fact, they were pretty damn disturbing. The first unusual thing I stumbled across was a collection of IDs. They were from different states, and many, if not all of them, had to have been fake. Every ID had Paul in the picture, but they each had a different name. I did find an ID in the pile that had the name Paul gave to me, but who knows if it's actually real. This discovery prompted me to do a little more exploring. Yes, I know I was being nosy and probably crossed a line, but I was just too intrigued not to. The next thing I found explained how he was always able to pay rent. I found dozens of credit cards and bills associated with the cards. They were all from a bunch of different names and different companies, most being the same names listed on the different IDs. It was pretty evident at this point that whatever Paul had going on must have been illegal. But that wasn't the worst thing I found. I came across a notebook. It looked like it was pretty old, but had the cover and back reinforced at some point. In it were pages and pages of all sorts of oddities, most of which were weird but also pretty irrelevant. But I found one section of the notebook that stood out from the rest. The first page of that section almost appeared as the cover of a book. It was titled Hit List. At first, I thought he might have actually been attempting to write a book or something, but once I continued reading, I found out it was something far different. Within the following pages were literally hundreds of entries. Each one had a person's name or description, followed by what they did to anger him. It would be things like, "Stephanie gave me a weird look. I could tell she was judging me." Or, "Black-haired librarian humiliated me by not letting me check books out because of my late fees." Everything in it was really petty for the most part. After every entry was a rating system or something. It went from 1 out of 5 to 5 out of 5. I guess he was rating how much these people angered him or something, I'm not really sure. Eventually I got everything packed and stored away. More and more time went by and I still never heard from Paul. I checked around at hospitals and jails, asking if someone with the name he gave me was ever at any of those places, and I couldn't find out anything about him. As I mentioned before, I still don't know if he gave me his real name anyway. It's been months now, and I still haven't heard from him. I'm hoping I don't at this point, because if he put people into a hit list over nothing, I don't know what he might do to me for going through his stuff and throwing it in my garage. So yeah, Paul, or whoever you really are, I really hope I never see you again. When I was a little younger, I really wanted a job. My parents gave me a small allowance, but it wasn't much. So by the time I was 13 and would regularly get invited to go bowling or go to the movies with my friends, I always wished I had more money. Being 13, I wasn't able to find any businesses that would hire me at that age. I eventually decided that I would place an ad for babysitting on Craigslist. For the first 2 weeks, I didn't get a single reply, other than some random person emailing me to tell me I needed to be careful due to the potential of predators lurking around. I was already aware of this possibility, but my parents were going to be bringing me to babysit to check out everything first before leaving me there, and that's assuming I ever found a gig. Eventually, I did get a reply that seemed pretty promising. A woman emailed me. Her name was Julie. She said her 6-year-old daughter needed a babysitter most nights for the next 2 weeks while she did a project for work. The pay was pretty decent, and there would be a nice amount of hours I would work after the 2 weeks was over. It was still around the beginning of my summer break, so I was looking forward to having extra money to go do things with my friends. The first day of my babysitting job was on a Monday. My parents brought me over to meet Julie and her 6-year-old daughter Olivia. It was just the two of them at the house when we arrived. It was a pretty nice house, and Julie herself seemed very nice. Everything looked completely normal, so my parents said their goodbyes and wished me luck. Julie gave me some general guidelines on when to make Olivia lunch and things like that. The first day was nice and easy. Olivia was pretty timid for a 6-year-old, but she was pretty pleasant and I didn't run into any problems. The second day, I was about 2 hours into watching her and there was a knock at the door. I hesitantly answered it, and there was a middle-aged man standing there waiting. He introduced himself as Olivia's father and said he had stopped by to pick her up. I really wasn't sure what to do because Julie didn't mention anything about this. Olivia eventually did come around the corner and saw the man, verifying it was in fact her dad. That made me feel a lot more comfortable. I told him Julie hadn't said anything about this and that I needed to call her. I got my cell phone out of my pocket to call Julie. At that point, the man told me not to worry about it, and that he would just come back later when Julie was home. As odd as that was, at the time, I really didn't think it was too strange. He said goodbye to Olivia and left. The rest of the day was completely normal. When Julie came home, I mentioned that Olivia's father stopped by to pick her up. She had a bit of a concerned look on her face, but only thanked me for handling the situation the way I did, and told me she would always tell me if something like that was going to happen beforehand. She also told me to just not answer the door when I am here alone with Olivia. The rest of the week went by with nothing unusual happening. The following Monday, I went back to start the second week of babysitting. That day, Olivia's father, whose name I learned to be Greg, stopped by the house again. Just like last time, it was only Olivia and I there. He knocked on the door. I quietly moved to look out the window to see who it was. Even though I could see it was Greg, I decided to follow Julie's direction and not answer the door. After maybe 20 seconds, he knocked again, and then again. Each time he would knock again, the knocking became louder and more aggressive. It got to the point where Greg was shouting through the door, demanding that I open it up and telling me he knew we were inside. I was very afraid at this point and called Julie as I wasn't sure what to do. By this point, the knocking finally stopped, and Greg appeared to have left. I didn't tell Julie how aggressive Greg was being. For some reason I thought it would somehow come back to bite me if he found out I had told on him or whatever, and I regret it to this day. Julie thanked me for calling, told me I did the right thing, and said she would take care of it. This made me feel a bit better, and I went back to watching Olivia. About 2 hours later, the two of us had just gotten done eating a snack, and were sitting on the couch watching cartoons. Out of nowhere, I heard a huge bang. Before I knew it, Greg was inside. He had forced open the back door. I started screaming out of fear, and Greg grabbed me by my arm and dragged me into the bathroom. He shut me in there and told me to be quiet, and that's what I did. I was terrified, and my cell phone was still on the couch. Things went pretty quiet after that, and I must have waited in the bathroom for another 30 minutes before coming out because of how scared I was. The house was empty. Neither Olivia or Greg were there. I immediately grabbed my phone and called Julie and then my parents. Julie, my dad, and the police showed up shortly after. An Amber Alert was put out for Olivia. It turned out that Julie and Greg had recently separated, and after a custody battle, Julie was granted full custody of Olivia. Therefore, Greg resorted to kidnapping his own daughter. The entire thing is crazy to me, but maybe I don't understand because I don't have kids. Olivia ended up being found later that day with Greg, just a few towns over. Greg was arrested and put in jail, although I'm not positive how long his sentence was. Olivia was returned safely to her mother and everything was okay in the end. But I still occasionally have nightmares about someone breaking into my home, and it was by far the most scared I've ever been. I'm a female in her late 20s. and I don't even want to use my first name in this story. When I was younger, I ended up getting addicted to prescription painkillers after I suffered an injury when I was in a car accident. Over the course of several years, I went from taking the pills for pain to buying them on the streets to use recreationally. Eventually, the prescription pills became hard to find, and some people that I considered friends at the time introduced me to heroin. Once I found out I could get way more out of it for way less money, I became hooked right away. Over the next year after trying heroin, my tolerance grew, and I used more and more until I needed to spend $150 per day to maintain my habit. I wasn't good at stealing and hated doing it anyway. I struggled to keep any job, and even when I had one, I never made enough. Eventually, a friend of mine told me how she made enough money to get everything she needed. She would prostitute herself. The idea sounded horrifying to me, and at first I said there was no way I could ever do that. But once she showed me how she did it, I eventually warmed up to it. All she did was place an ad on Craigslist with a couple pictures and a somewhat vague description about just escorting guys. Of course, the true nature behind the posts were never described, but it was pretty obvious. Once a guy would reply, she would either go meet him somewhere or have him come to her motel room she rented by the week. I was first picturing having to walk the streets to do this, but once she showed me how, it didn't seem so bad, and the money she made was great. So I'm ashamed to say it, but I made my own post on Craigslist. This became my job for the next month. Although I didn't like it, the money was great, and I could finally support my habit without having to constantly worry. The only protection I brought with me was a pocket knife and condoms. The longer I did this, though, the more comfortable I felt. Eventually, a man responded to the ad by calling me and asked me to come meet him. Nothing out of the ordinary. I met the guy and he suggested we drive to a secluded location. Again, this was all totally normal for me. He drove us a couple miles out of town to a wooded area and parked the car. Once we were about to get down to business, he got very rough with me. I told him that I don't do things like that, and he responded by slapping me. I struggled to get away, but he dragged me out of the car by my hair and threw me to the ground. From there, he took advantage of me while pulling my hair and even choking me at times. Once he was done, I just got up and tried getting away from him. I didn't care if I had to walk back to town. But he quickly chased me down and threw me back on the ground. He started striking me with his fists to the point I was barely conscious. I began crawling away once he finally stopped hitting me, but after several seconds, I saw him coming back towards me with a small log and swinging it at me. The next thing I remembered, I was waking up in the woods. I didn't know what time it was, but it was dark out. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I began walking. My head, face, and neck were in a ton of pain. I felt my face and head and could feel how swollen it was in parts. After maybe an hour and a half, I finally made it to town. I found someone to call to get me help. While in the hospital, I gave the police the best description and information I could, but they were never able to find the guy. But there is a silver lining to this horrific story. I was in the hospital several days. They decided to keep me admitted due to my addiction, and they detoxed me while I was there. I voluntarily went into a rehab program, and I'm happy to say that I've been clean for several years now. My life is nothing like it used to be. I still hope the man is eventually caught, but I am so grateful I no longer have to put my life in danger every day just so I don't end up sick. A few years ago, I went through a breakup with my then girlfriend. The breakup resulted in her moving out of our apartment and in with one of her friends. It was a crappy time in my life, but whatever. It didn't take me long to realize that I was going to need a roommate in order for me to be able to afford everything. I put an ad on Craigslist, as it was the easiest way to advertise a room I had for rent, and I've had good success with Craigslist in the past for other things. Only a couple hours after posting, I got a text message from someone wanting to come check out the room. With my fingers crossed, I invited him over and he decided to come right away to look at the place. He showed up about a half hour later and introduced himself. His name was Darren. He had a good job, made a lot of money, and seemed like a really awesome, clean-cut guy. He was right around the same age as me, and we seemed to have a few things in common. He told me he needed to think about it, but would let me know soon. Only another half hour went by before he called me. He told me the room was exactly what he was looking for, and he wanted to take it. I thought it was great. About an hour later, he showed up with his belongings and rent money. He moved his things in, and that was it. A few hours after posting the ad, I had a roommate completely moved in. I couldn't have been happier about it at the moment. Later that evening, we got to know each other better. I explained my situation to him, and he explained his situation to me. He had just found out that his wife was cheating on him with one of his friends. He wanted out of their house immediately. I can't say I blame him for that. Over the next 2 weeks, things went great. Our personalities meshed together well and there were no issues. I worked third shift, so I sleep during the day. After 2 weeks of Darren living with me, I woke up one evening to find a text message from him. It basically said that him living with me wouldn't help resolve any issues he had with his wife, and he felt it was better that he lived at home. Before responding, I went to use the restroom. I walked by his room and found it to be completely empty. He moved out just as fast as he had moved in. I was very surprised at this. He didn't seem like the type of guy that would just bail, but I guess I did already see how impulsive he could be. We talked a tad more after that, basically him apologizing and me wishing him luck. I reposted my ad and hoped I would have better luck at it this time when it came to finding a more permanent roommate. I got a few responses within the next 2 days, but only one that actually ended up coming to look at the place. It was a girl around my age. She seemed nice enough and had a good job, and she decided to move in. She said she would be moving in after the weekend was over. On Monday, she sent me a text saying it would be a few more days. Then a week went by and I heard nothing from her. She had already paid me rent and everything. A few more days go by and I was asleep. It was around 4 p.m. and I had just gone to sleep a few hours before. I suddenly got woken up by a loud, startling knock on my bedroom window. It was Darren. He was here to move back in. He had his belongings with him and everything. I explained the situation to him about the girl that was moving in. He told me that she obviously wasn't coming. Since she had already paid for the month, I couldn't allow him to move in. He persisted, but I said no. That night I went to work and everything was fine. When I came home in the morning, I found Darren at my apartment, completely moved back in. He had climbed through a window of mine to gain access to my apartment. I was absolutely shocked and told him that wasn't okay. He replied by saying I should be lucky to have a roommate like him, and that I would have better financial stability with him there. I really didn't know what to do. It was possible the girl wasn't coming at all. It had been 10 days since she was supposed to move in, and I hadn't heard from her at all. I ended up letting Darren stay, as I did like him, aside from what he had done. He kept bouncing back and forth between our apartment and his house where his wife was. After 2 more weeks went by, I felt more comfortable. The time period the girl paid for to rent the room was up, so I felt like I was in the clear. And then I got a text message from her. She apologized and said she was still coming. I explained her month was up and she never got a hold of me the last few weeks and that the room was now occupied. I didn't hear from her again until the next day. She sent me another text explaining that her month wouldn't start until she moved in. I told her that didn't make any sense and that I couldn't go a month without a roommate helping me pay bills, and I couldn't just hold a room for someone for a month for free. We argued for a bit back and forth, and then I stopped hearing from her for a couple days. Then I got a knock on my door. It was the girl. She asked if I could come outside so we could talk. I hesitantly agreed, which was a huge mistake. Waiting for me outside was her dad and her brother. They began arguing with me as well. I held my ground and said she should have come during the month she paid for. And holding my ground soon led to me getting attacked. Both her dad and her brother were much larger than me. Hell, even the girl herself had at least 80 pounds on me. I was getting the crap beat out of me and they wouldn't let up. I didn't know what to do and I couldn't get away. Then I heard someone yell from the distance a bit, and the beating finally stopped. I looked up and saw Darren walking towards us. He had a pistol in his hand and was yelling at the girl and her family, telling them to leave, and it worked. They immediately got in the car and took off. Since then, I've never heard from her. I didn't call the police, which I now regret, but I've healed fine and those people are out of my life, at least for now. Believe it or not, Darren and I still live together. He's got his issues and stuff and technically pulled a B&E on me at one point, but he didn't mean any harm. He was going through a situation that must have been hell for him. Plus, he saved me from getting beat even worse than I already was. We're good friends now, and he's been nothing but a good roommate and a good friend ever since. Hey guys, I really appreciate you watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Those of you that enjoyed my streams on YouTube, I'm now streaming exclusively on Twitch, so please come follow me there at twitch.tv/SirSpooksALotYT. The link will be in the description. I stream there frequently, do giveaways, and all sorts of other stuff, so make sure you guys follow me. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you guys soon.